Hello and welcome back to the Bird's Eye View podcast. We are here on Tuesday, July 8th. I'm your host, Zach Worden, joined as always by Jori Negin-Shecter. And we're super excited today to have a returning guest to the show. It is Nick Ashbourne, a Blue Jays writer at Sportsnet, the host of Blue Jays Happy Hour and Jays Talk. Nick, thanks so much for thanks so much for coming back on. Excited to have you back on today.
I mean, it's a fun time to talk about Blue Jays baseball. You could argue that's always the case, but sometimes it does feel like a bit of a slog, and the quality of the product is a little bit different. The vibe around the team is a little bit different, and it feels like even, not the pure baseball and Blue Jays sickos are starting to jump on board. Like the city is jumping on board. Sports fans are becoming aware that this is a pretty interesting team.
Yeah, there's no summer quite like a summer where the Blue Jays are good. And as we sit here today, they are in the midst of a 9-game win streak, the first time they've done that since 2015. They tied the franchise record for most wins before the All-Star break. And of course, we still have 5 more games to go before, that break officially hits. So it's been quite the stretch here. I mean, I think that we got to kind of start with the win streak. What have you kind of seen from them that's changed to be able to, sweep the Yankees, sweep the Angels, and get off to a good start last night against the White Sox?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that a lot of people are talking about, but really rings true, is the variety of contributions they're getting. Like, this is not a stretch where Vladdy is being superhuman. Now, we did see Springer during the Yankee series, like as an individual, really take off, and Barger certainly had some great performances too. But it does feel like any given guy in the bottom of the lineup might come through. Like the idea of getting back-to-back home runs from Joey Loperfido and Nathan Lucas in a game, like, sounds kind of absurd, but that's the sort of thing that's happening on a relatively regular basis. In terms of the longer term and how it's changed how I feel about the team, one thing that's impressed me has been the bullpen, especially again going back to the Yankee series because that's the toughest competition that they faced. They really have this group of high leverage guys who've performed really well, but they're not super proven. And they were kind of put in that playoff scenario where we're going to the same guys again and again in high leverage spots. And you know what, Yariel, you're going to pitch 3 days with 20 plus pitches in a 4 day span. And Hoffman, you're going to have to save 3 of these 4 games. And they've been in a lot of tight ones. And this group of, right now with Garcia on the IL, a group of Hoffman and Yariel, Brendan Little has had some walk issues, but still, like, he strikes out so many guys that it doesn't tend to matter. And, Braden Fisher has been immensely impressive since coming to the big leagues as well. That group that I know people still want to improve on, and I'm sure there'll be some trade deadline talk here, but that group has been better than expected. And that was a little bit of a trial by fire for them that I thought that they came out of really well.
Yeah, the bullpen's been great, and obviously the offense has been a huge story too, especially considering, honestly, we're going on years where it was, oh, they need some power, they need some this, they need some that. Well, they found it, and it's been thanks to a number of contributors. But I'd be curious, in your eyes, who the biggest story has been on the offensive side of the baseball.
It's hard not to say Addison Barger, right? You can talk about George Springer and at his advanced age, what he's been able to do. But at least we knew this was something that Springer was theoretically capable of, even if, it would have been unreasonable to say he was going to do it or overly optimistic to say in his mid 30s he's going to have this renaissance. We have seen something like this before, even in a Blue Jays uniform, even in kind of 2021. We've seen this version of Springer before. Alejandro Kirk heading back to the All-Star game. We've seen Kirk be this good before. Maybe not the total package with the defense and the offense because his defense has come along since 2022, but broadly we've seen it. And last year when Addison Barger came up, a lot of people would have said, like, this is a guy of that group of young players. Like, they said this huge cohort of MLB ready quasi prospects, a little bit older than you want, but maybe have some talent guys. Barger was always the most interesting one because he had the loud tools. He had the ability to hit the ball really hard. He's a respectable runner, at least someone who can get around the outfield to a solid defensive potential. And that arm that's, like, literally among the best in the entire league. And so that's a cool package. And that's a more interesting package than a Will Wagner is going to bring, or than, Nathan Lucas. It's not to disparage those guys, but some of the things that Barger has are just things that other guys don't. And last year, he looked really unrefined in his approach. He was a bit wild. He was a bit over aggressive. And then what you've seen from him this year is he's made progress on both sides of it. So he is more refined. Now, he's not suddenly Joey Votto or the best version of Vladdy in terms of being able to spit on pitches. Like he still is going to strike out. He's not going to take a ton of walks. I'd compare him more to kind of a Bo Bichette approach where he's looking to hit the baseball, and that's priority number one for him. But he's refined a little bit, and then he's also seemingly gotten stronger. Like the exit velocity, which we were already complimenting before, is even better. The max exit velocity, which suggests the highest end of his power, that has gotten even higher than we thought before. So like that aspect, you would expect a young player to get a little bit more delicate with their approach to the plate, a little bit more disciplined. And I think we all saw in Barger the potential for him to be a really interesting player. But then suddenly that in his mid 20s, even the tools get better as well. And now, you're looking at a guy who's been a middle of the lineup force for, quite some time now.
He's been kind of at the heart of this like turnaround for them this season. It seems, his breakout has kind of coincided with the wins starting to rack up for them. I guess, the question with him, I mean, is this going to be who he is for, the next couple years? And is that something that you can kind of see him being able to sustain going forward, or is there going to be, some kind of drop off, and why would that be?
I think there's still some hurdles. Like it's tough to say that. Like I know that everyone is exceedingly excited about him and wants to say like here's a long-term star and a building
Yeah.
block for the Blue Jays, and he might be. But there's also you have to think about a couple things. One is that he really has not hit left-handed pitching at this level. Like he hasn't had many opportunities to do it. And it also at this point it makes sense. The Jays are serious about winning ball games. So they're not really focusing on his development so much as what can we do to win the next day. Like you're in a battle for division. So I understand why that is he's just not getting as many opportunities that way, but he's had very few opportunities there and he hasn't done much with the ones he's had. So there's a little bit of a platoon risk with him that still exists. And I do think that we haven't maybe seen him go for long enough to know where that strikeout rate is gonna wind up in the end. Because we do know it's a guy who lets it rip with his swings and who is not the most patient guy in the world. So I think we could see some strikeout spikes from him some point down the line. But I think at the very minimum, you're looking at a power threat, big side of a platoon bat with defensive versatility. And that's a really important player. And again, right now he looks like a star player. And again, like the sort of guy where we say, oh, the core is Vladdy and Kirk and Barger. And again, I don't want to rule that out because he is so talented that it's tough. And the progress he's made this year shows the capacity to make further progress. But I think it's putting the cart before the horse a little bit to say, okay, this guy's locked in. He's a star. He's part of the core. He's a guy you're building around going forward. But there's not a lot that he's done to make you feel pessimistic. I'll put it that way.
I'll just counter maybe with this. Since their 27-10 run, he's got a 161 WRC plus and hitting close to 300, obviously average, take it as you will. But for a guy who's got big strikeout stuff, obviously that's really incredible. Are you just you think the sample is too small? Like when are you ready to anoint him the next Josh Donaldson, I guess is the question.
It's going to take some time. It's funny, even in Blue Jays history, you can think back to a couple of third basemen, like Brett Laurie, for instance, when he came up and everyone was sure that he was the next superstar. And he honestly, Barger has done it for longer than Laurie did, to be fair, because Laurie was kind of part of August through September. But again, this is the guy who had tons of tools and talent. And honestly, Laurie had quite a bit more pedigree than Barger had. Barger hasn't been a top prospect for a ton of his career. That's another part of it. It's not like, when Vladdy came up, Vladdy had made a mockery of the minor leagues for years. And that's why we're all saying, okay, the moment he shows something, we're all in because we know the talent is there. With Barger, it's a little bit newer. His track record in the minor leagues is good, but it's not unbelievable. So yeah, I think about Brett Laurie. I also think a little bit about Bo Bichette. When Bichette first came up, he was he was as a rookie better than he's been since. And again, I think that with these guys, especially guys who are a little bit more swing happy, there's maybe more opportunity for pitchers to counter them a little bit. And then there's the southpaw element. So I don't want to take anything away from him. He's a really good player. He's immensely talented and he's going to be important for the Blue Jays going forward, but we're going to learn just how important, in the rest of this year and the years to come.
Yeah, it's been an incredible breakout and like obviously very very important to the Blue Jays success. I'm glad that you brought up Kirk because I think, along the lines of Barger being important, Kirk has kind of been right there with him. Maybe the Blue Jays MVP to this point. Obviously, he leads the team in F WAR at this point. Going back to his second career All-Star game, what have you kind of seen from him at the plate that's kind of contributed to his transition, kind of not necessarily back into the hitter that we saw in 2022, but, into this hitter that has been really productive and really important to this Blue Jays lineup?
Well, even in the spring, there was sort of a little inkling that he was hitting the ball a bit differently. And we've seen flashes of that from him in the past. In 2021 and 2022, as you mentioned, he really looked like he was going to be a dynamic offensive player. Like if people thought that he may be more of a part-time DH than a catcher, which sounds so silly now based on what we've seen from him defensively. But that was a real notion around him. And so we've kind of been waiting to see that again. And when someone gives you a year where they disappoint, it's often you're able to say, okay, that's an off year. It happens in baseball, seemingly, I think, more than it happens in a lot of other sports where a really talented player will just have a year that's not it for whatever reason. But then Kirk puts together two of those in a row. And you think, okay, well, this is a guy, immense credit to his defense. He's just a slap hitter who plays great defense. And that's a perfectly fine starting catcher, above average starting catcher, to be honest. But now, he's performing like a star. You say he's going to the All-Star game again. And he's just hitting the ball so much harder. Like he's in some of the league leading kind of grouping when it comes to things like hard hit rate. And yeah, he's not a guy who's going to hit an individual ball that's 120 miles per. Like he's not O'Neill Cruz, but he's someone who's so consistently giving you those line drives sprayed around the field. And yeah, he gets robbed of the odd double because he can't run very well. And so sometimes the power numbers don't look particularly good. It is a very flat swing. He's not going to hit a ton of home runs. That's the reality of it. But when you're a guy who strikes out, like 10% of the time, like a ludicrously low percentage of the time, and it's come down over the course of the season, and the walk rates come up over the course of the season too, which has played a role in this. But when you're a guy who strikes out that infrequently, one of the lowest rates in the league, and you also have a hard hit rate at one of the highest rates in the league, like that's a very uncommon combination. And you throw in a decent walk rate, and you've got a very strong offensive player. Like for a guy who doesn't really have power or speed, that's about as good an offensive player as you can be, is what he is right now.
I mean, his offense obviously doing a lot of the carrying, but his defense too, so incredible. Just for you, you mentioned the two down years. How much of a surprise, I guess, it has this Kirk kind of revelation into becoming an all-star again been for you?
It's interesting because he was a guy who, like, the projections always really liked Kirk to
Yeah.
bounce back in a way that I personally felt like it didn't totally make sense based on what you'd seen over a 2 year span. So I will say that I was pretty surprised to see this because it seemed like he locked into kind of relatively stable pattern of production, which again was above average starting catcher that you're totally happy to have on the team, especially when he's not making a bunch of money. So, he is still, we forget that he's still relatively young because he came up so young. And we do sometimes see hitters in their kind of mid, late 20s get a little bit stronger, get a little bit wiser, whatever it is, where they just do find another level. It's possible also that he focused so much on improving that defense and making that priority number one that he was able to, bring it back on an offense. Everyone wants to talk about David Popkins and the potential impact that he's had. It's tough to say. Like that's kind of speculative, right? We don't really know what would have we don't have a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened if it had been someone else. We don't know what happened if, he had come 2 years earlier. How would that affected? I'm hesitant to be as quick as some other people are to say, okay, this new hitting coach, new performance, bang, that's a 1-to-1. It's just one of those things that's a little bit of a mystery, but when you do have a player whose performance has ticked up in such a significant way, it is definitely worth thinking about if hearing different advice and different coaching is a factor in that.
I want to go back a little bit on him. Just obviously before the year, he kind of gets the extension, which now looks excellently timed by the organization for them to kind of get him locked up. He gets extended, and then Cal Raleigh gets extended, and they both, put together these really great seasons. But of course, there's different dollar points and different performance levels for the two of them. What were your kind of thoughts at the time of the extension, and how do you kind of view that aging now that he's kind of put together this great first half?
I mean, it looks like it's going to be an awesome deal. I like the deal a lot when it happened because it felt like a pretty solid rate for someone
Yeah.
who, again, just based on that defense, projected to be an elite defensive catcher, and that's worth a lot. And so if he was hovering around average offensively, and again, because he didn't really strike out and he walked a decent amount, there was a decent floor on him too. Like he was below average, but he wasn't going to sink much further than that
Yeah.
because the ball was often in play and he had a solid on base rate. So I felt like that was a kind of like it was a tidy, solid, win for both sides too, because that's a good chunk of money.
Yeah.
I felt like that's a good thing for the organization to do. And obviously, with this new context, it feels more like, okay, this is, you talk about what's the core of the Jays going forward. Vladdy and Kirk are very much at the top of that conversation. And so I think there's a couple things that went into the fact it wasn't a crazy lucrative contract. I think there's some level of doubt about his ability to carry a load over a full season. He shared catching duties with Danny Jansen for much of his career, took the odd DH day. And so far, we haven't seen any indication that that's an issue. Like he's logged a pretty heavy workload so far, even though Heineman has, he was great, especially early on, less great recently, but they had an excuse to share a little bit more than they did,
Yeah.
but they always knew that Kirk is the superior player, and they haven't treated him with kid gloves, and that's worked out well. And then there's the other thing, and this is so subjective, right? But when people have a body type like Kirk has, there is some level of questioning how that will hold up and age over a longer period of time. And I don't know what to say about that. We'll have to see how that goes. I will say that because he is young, you feel better about it, right? Like if you are signing a 31-year-old Alejandro Kirk to a
Yeah.
lengthy deal, that's a very different proposition than signing a guy in his mid 20s to this contract that's not going to take him too deep into his 30s.
Yeah, it's definitely the timing of it all makes a lot of sense. So Kirk's an all-star, Vladdy, of course, an all-star, and maybe we'll get into kind of him and his own kind of weird season. George Springer, though, not an all-star. Surprised, shocked, not shocked, thoughts?
I mean, there's a couple theories on the case with this. For one, yeah, I think it's fair to say he's deserving. He's been one of the most dangerous hitters in the American League. So is he deserving? Sure, absolutely. I think that there's two issues. One, where a lot of voting happens before he has this massive streak against the Yankees, so he doesn't really get a chance to get voted in. And his number just looked quite like still looked strong before that happened, but they looked different. And then the second thing is, and this is a little bit of a theory of the case of people writing about it and kind of the press around it. I think when people write about all stars and things like that, you're often talking about national writers who are not necessarily 100% clued in on everything that's happening in every single market. So what you're going to see is a lot of people sifting through, to be honest, sifting through WAR leaderboards.
Yeah.
And he's not up there. And it's because in a very small sample, he put up horrendous defensive metrics in the outfield. And like, how real is that? I don't know. It's such a small sample, it doesn't really matter. And then the second thing is that he has DH'd a ton. So as a result of those two things, his quote, yeah, his total value, his WAR has been dragged down. So when guys are kind of popping around, seeing like, oh, who's having a good season, he's actually kind of falling out of what I think people who are seeing it. So he doesn't even really show up in kind of snubs articles. He just doesn't really get any sort of push from a media perspective. I mean, I'm sure local media, sure, but kind of in the broader baseball world. So those are the two things I would say account for why that happened. George Springer, extremely accomplished MLB player. He's got his money. I don't think he's super worried about the snub. If anything, a guy his age probably getting the full week off is the best possible outcome. So I don't think anyone needs to feel too badly for George.
It's I'm sure, there'll of course be some injury replacements coming up, and I'm sure he will be widely considered to be one of those, obviously with the season that he's had and the recent stretch here. I guess kind of, going into a little bit of the why he's been so good. I know we talk a little bit about him kind of getting his A swing off. I know they showed, I think, A swing percentage on the broadcast the other day. And he's obviously, the swing decisions have been way better. But for you kind of watching him, what have you kind of seen from his at bats that have kind of, contributed to this huge season so far?
Yeah, and the what has got a lot of press has a lot to do with it. I think when you have an aging hitter, there's usually some kind of trade-off that has to get made at a certain point. And some guys seem to say, you know what, I don't have quite the reaction time that I used to have. I'm going to sell out for power. Like you saw that with late career Alex Rodriguez, even to an extent Joey Votto at the very end, which
Yeah.
is kind of unexpected given what we saw from him for the rest of his career. But then on the flip side, I think you get some guys who, and this is a little bit of pop psychology here, so take that for what it's worth. But I think there's some guys who don't really want to get embarrassed as they get
Yeah.
older. And so they get a little bit more conservative and they get a little bit more contact focused. And they want to see the scoreboard say 260 up there, even if the home runs aren't there, as opposed to saying 210. As silly as we can talk about batting average, how you evaluate players, I think that's a very real thing. And an example I think of in that vein would be like a Miguel Cabrera, who many people would have said, even in his later career, was a quote unquote a good hitter because he was spraying line drives around and getting on base, but he just wasn't the threat that he'd been before. And I think there was a little bit of that with Springer. I think over the last couple of years, like you saw his strikeout rates went down to kind of well below league average. Even though that's not the hitter he'd been at his best. Like even when he was really good in his Houston Astros career, he'd struck out a fair amount and sold out for power a fair amount. And I do wonder to some degree if the leadoff thing has to do with that, if he kind of
Yeah.
felt like he had to be a leadoff hitter because that's the role he was put in. And dropping him down in the order, I think was a smart idea at the beginning of the year. Just projecting him out, you had no reason to believe he would hit well
Yeah.
enough to justify that, like putting style aside. But I think that he's found a more comfortable place where he's willing to swing and miss, willing to strike out, willing to, as a lot of people talked about, willing to get down in the count. And to his credit, I think part of the reason why he's been able to survive that is that he's done a really good job of taking pitches and walking too. So if he gets down in the count, he's been better at avoiding chasing, and so he works himself back in a little bit more than we've seen in some seasons from him. But I mean, it's a really compelling overall package. The power
Yeah.
is there, and he's getting on base with a high walk rate too. And he's one of those guys who's just learned how to steal a base in his mid to late 30s, which nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, it's been just kind of crazy to see, honestly. I know everybody was kind of counting him out after his poor spring training. So really cool to see him kind of break out. I'm glad you brought up the leadoff thing because obviously, since Bo missed most of the Yankee series, obviously he had the pinch hit and they've kind of, mix and match that leadoff spot there. It's kind of contributed to this whole the lineup kind of, being anybody you throw in there is going to produce, and the leadoff spot has kind of been a part of that. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but just kind of the contributions from up and down the lineup. I mean, how surprising has it been to you? You see Joey Loperfido come up and hit a home run in his second game up, having a big game right away. Kind of every night it's been somebody different stepping up. Like how surprising has that been to you to kind of watch for this team that has really kind of embodied like this 26 man, we're 26 against 9, I guess, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Lo Perfido's a good example, right? Because he's someone who was having kind of a fine season at
Yeah.
AAA, like not unbelievable, especially for someone his age who has seen that level quite a bit in the past. And he comes up and he gets a game-tying hit off a left-handed pitcher in his first game. He hits the big home run and another big hit in his second. I don't know how much you can count on that going forward, but Nathan Lucas. This guy's had such a tough luck career. He's had injuries at the wrong time. He hasn't gotten opportunities. He's probably been in organizations that are too good, to be honest. I
Yeah.
think if he had been in the Pirates organization earlier in his career, he might be a 6-year MLB vet by now. Him continuing to produce against right-handed pitching enough that they are comfortable giving him like consistent leadoff starts, and that's sort of the way his offense profiles. Like, is he going to be good enough for that long term? We'll see, but they're Ernie Clement off to an awful start to the season, right? And you kind of thought, okay, well, last year you really got the best out of
Yeah.
Ernie, and that was more than you really want to see from him. And he's more of a utility guy. And this is, chickens are coming home to roost on this, and that's fine. And he's a bench guy. And then suddenly just heats up, becomes one of the hottest guys in baseball for a while, establishing himself as this crazy lefty masher. And, that's probably long term his future is to be a platoon guy slash utility guy, but someone's sort of always injured anyway, so he's going to get starts. He plays good enough defense that even when he's playing righties and he's struggling offensively, he still gives you a lot. And there's just an aspect of baseball where it's a weak link sport. Like if you're the bottom of your lineup sucks, that's a third of your lineup. If the bottom of your bench sucks in basketball, those guys are taking like 4 shots a game. So you need everybody to chip in to a certain degree. And the Jays have not really, I said Springer's been one of the best hitters, fair enough. Barger's been great, but it's not like they've had these massive superstar performances. They don't have anyone in the starting rotation who's performing like an
Yeah.
ace. Hoffman's been good recently, but he hasn't been a relief ace over the course of the season, at least in sort of pure results. Vladdy has been objectively good, but not quite what you would want him to be. You could say the same about Bo. And so not only has it sort of been a good story of like, wow, it's amazing that all these guys have chipped in, they've needed that because the top of the roster actually is not driving success in the way that you would normally see with a division leading team.
This episode of the Bird's Eye View podcast is brought to you by BioSteel. Use code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order at biosteel.ca. Again, that's code Bird's Eye View at checkout for 20% off your order. For all your high performance hydration needs, visit biosteel.ca. Thank you again to BioSteel for sponsoring today's episode. Yeah, for all of the 2015 comparisons in terms of actual production, probably couldn't be any less, similar. You think of those teams driven by the trio of Donaldson, Bautista, and Encarnacion. Like that was a fearsome three. I don't know if I can necessarily name a fearsome three on this Blue Jays team, but I kind of feel like that's for the best because, like we kind of said, it's really a 1 through 9 situation.
Yeah, I mean, when people came on in terms of that 2015, like I think of Ben Revere becoming a little bit of a folk hero for the Jays. Like, why did that happen? Because they had nothing there when they made that trade. And this team, you could argue this team has holes too. We'll see if Scherzer is able to hold up for a number of starts. Eric Lauer is a threat to turn back into a pumpkin at any time. The rotation could end up, especially if one of their top three guys got hurt, things could get dicey there relatively quickly. But generally speaking, when you're talking about making additions to this team, you are putting someone not on top of a black hole, but on top of someone who's actually producing relatively well. And you're looking for someone who can be better. Like the most obvious position player fit that people talk about is the right-handed bat to replace Davis Schneider. And I think that's fair enough. I don't think that Schneider's someone you necessarily want facing one of the top left-handed starters or relievers in the world in a playoff situation. I think you can probably do better than that. But if you look at what he's doing, he's been pretty good, since he came back. Like even the guys you're looking to replace, you might say, oh, is Nathan Lucas really someone you want to be the main side of a platoon in left field? He's performing that well. Like you can question the talent, you can question the projection, but there aren't a lot of places on the roster where guys are not performing, which is one of the things that is going to make it a more interesting deadline for the team.
And also part of the deadline equation is you're going to be getting Varsho and Santander back, right? So how do those guys fit into the picture?
I mean, I just mentioned Lucas. I think, he's probably the biggest victim potential. Well, like Loperfido is the guy that, you're not going to likely see him in the longer term unless he does an Addison Barger, which I suppose is on the table. And then, I think Nathan Lucas could be a victim too. Like this is a left-handed hitting outfielder. Varsho simply has to play because of what he offers defensively. Santander has to play, I think, in part just because of the commitment the organization has made to him. I don't think they're going to say give up on him if they feel he's healthy. And, to be fair, imagine the power that he can theoretically bring to this lineup too, if he is healthy and if he produces maybe not like last year, but like one of his other seasons. Like both Varsho and Santander are credible power threats, and the guys they'd be lifting from the lineup aren't really. So there's potential for the lineup to reach a bit of a different gear from a power standpoint when those guys come back. But I think you have to be more optimistic with Varsho that that's a thing that's going to happen soon, and that when it does happen, based on how well he'd performed both in spring and briefly, and what's almost a cameo at this point, this season, that he's going to give you that element.
A pretty decent cameo. The 8 homers were obviously huge for the team at that time. I guess we can kind of go more into deadline stuff. I think you kind of mentioned there like the lineup, some really tough decisions to be made there, and then the rotation. I mean, they have the 5 guys who are filling those spots right now, but it does kind of sound like that's going to be the area that they might be looking, along with some help in the bullpen. What are you kind of expecting to see from them as we get closer to the deadline and as the deadline ultimately passes?
I think that there's probably room for a reliever in the sense that there's always room for a reliever. They don't really have another lefty. I mean, you could see Fluharty at another point in the season, I suppose, but they don't really have another lefty beyond Little, and that can get tricky in certain matchups. So I think that's something that they might want to look at. With the starting pitching, it's easy to say, man, what this team could really use is an ace to knock everyone down a peg, and then the line, and then it fills out, and maybe if he has control too, that helps mitigate losses of Bassett and Scherzer in the future, Barrios and Gosman. I'm
Yeah.
just not sure if that player is out there for them, a player that fits that description, who has term and who would really, start a playoff game and you'd feel really good about that. So I could definitely see them adding someone to the back end, whether it means that Scherzer has been hurt or it means that Lauer has not performed as much and maybe Lauer becomes a second bullpen lefty, or they could even do, some six-man rotation stuff because they don't actually have that one individual pitcher that you feel like has to take his start. And they have some older guys who they might feel better about resting a little bit. Obviously, Scherzer in particular, but even Gosman has been known to pitch better on a little bit more rest. So I think the priority or the kind of non-pie in the sky priority I could see for them is sort of that back end starter, and then maybe a lefty reliever. I don't know about the lineup. I don't know if people have said Eugenio Suarez because they want to see just yet another guy who hits a ton of bombs. As much as the farm system, it seems like has had some good stories this season. It's still not one of the greatest in the league. If they end up in a bidding war with someone else, it's hard to see them winning that unless they push it and someone that you're talking about, your Savage and Namala, guys who you really don't want to push in,
Yeah.
generally speaking. So I don't think it's going to be a super dramatic deadline for the Blue Jays, as much as I'm sure people want that excitement to continue and the good vibes to keep rolling. But I think the good news is that the returning players should make an impact and that it's a good thing that they don't have these glaring holes where if they don't fill them at the deadline, they're going to be in horrible shape.
Now, Nick, you're probably one of the more analytical baseball minds I know. You're one of the more reasonable, more rational baseball minds I know. But I want you to take off the smartest baseball guy I know hat for a moment here because it's certainly one of the one hats that you wear. And give me a dream deadline. Give me a pie in the sky, as you said, trade deadline. Who would your dream ad be for this Blue Jays team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be a top of the rotation guy. It would be a Jacob deGrom is healthy and you bring him in type situation. Like, and then you have deGrom and Scherzer, which is hilarious, both at like the very end of their career. See if you can
Yeah.
ring
Welcome
the
back the
last great.
2022 New York Mets with Chris
Yeah,
Bassett as well.
exactly. I think that that's sort of the guy that pops out as here's a guy who can, at least when he's healthy, perform at that level and would knock some guys down and you would feel great about him in a playoff situation. I don't really see people have joked about Paul Skeens and would Pittsburgh consider trading him, yada, yada. I don't even know if the Jays have enough to trade, even if they said we're emptying the clip here. I just don't know if there's a deal that Pittsburgh would even accept. Yeah, in a perfect world, like even when I'm trying to do the pie in the sky thing, I have a hard time conjuring that top rotation pitcher that has term that would be kind of the Barrios move, but
Yeah.
even better type deal. I just don't know if that's out there. It's so hard to get other teams to give up on pitchers with term, especially top rotation guys. But yeah, a guy reaching the end, maybe.
I'm interested by the six-man rotation idea that you brought up. I know for a bullpen that has been worked as hard as this one, like it's maybe not the ideal thing to do, but I do, think that it's a good point that, some of the aging guys could probably use with the extra day of rest. And then, you could keep all these guys in there, if Eric Lauer fades and, maybe Alek Manoah's in there, Max Scherzer, Manoah can kind of all factor in there. Do you think that like a six-man rotation would be the way to go if they do land like say a Merrill Kelly type?
I think it could be in play maybe as a temporary thing. I don't know if they would take it all the way to the end of the season. And also got to remember that Alek Manoah is lurking in the back here, and you have no idea what that is. Like that is as big a wild card as you can imagine. This guy has not been effective since 2022, and he's coming off surgery.
Yeah.
So we last time we saw him, he wasn't great, and that was a while ago. And so, like to say he could make an impact and it will make a difference that's going to change their plans, who knows? But I think that that's something to think about, that even if they didn't make the ad, maybe that there's a world where Manoah comes back and they do that for a little bit as well. Again, I don't think there's a huge track record for people running these 6-man rotations for a huge period of time and it going well, but the Jays do have the benefit, like I said before, of not having that one individual ace who you feel like you're diluting your team by not having him every fifth day. They kind of have a bit of a flat rotation from a talent standpoint. Again, Lauer and Scherzer are a half step below the other guys, but it is flatter than most teams. And so the opportunity for that to happen, I think, is greater for the Blue Jays than it is for most teams, but that still doesn't, there's a reason why it's not a common strategy still.
Would you even put Alek Manoah into the mix before the roster expands to 28 and you kind of have the flexibility to bring him up? Do you even think that's a risk that the Jays would take?
I think it depends on where they are. Like if they don't feel good about who they have going, they're gonna know so much more about Manoah than we will, right? Like
Yeah.
we might see the odd result from a rehab start, or we can even watch it on MILB TV or whatever. But they're gonna have so much more data. They're gonna be watching side sessions and bullpens, and they're gonna have an excellent sense of, okay, where is his command actually? Where is his stuff actually? I think that's one of the things with the way that our understanding of pitching has advanced, is that it doesn't take as much of a sample as it used to for people to get a sense of how good a pitcher's stuff is, how good his command is. Like it used to be that people would say, okay, give him 10 starts before we actually know where he is. But now that there's so much data on, the movement of every single pitch, vertically, horizontally, the spin on all of it, the precise location, it really doesn't take as long. And we've seen in the past people getting contracts after pitching barely at all the previous season because people just say, "Oh, we saw the stuff and we're going to bet on the stuff." And so the Jays will do that internally where they'll determine, okay, where is Manoah from a stuff standpoint? And is he someone we're going to push aggressively? Or, like you say, is it worth being patient with him in order to not compromise our roster flexibility?
As far as, their approach internally goes with, you mentioned kind of the farm system has been better this year with a couple breakout stories on a scale of like, high A reliever to Arjun Nimala, how willing or how all in would you want them or expect them to go to add at this deadline with the chance to win the AL East and the weak American League and everything?
I mean, you never want to say that anyone is quote unquote off the table because there's always the right situation and the right trade where someone could be available. I personally, and again, I'm not trying to position myself as the greatest expert who's grinding the film on every
That's why
minor
we
leaguer
have
in
you
the
on,
system.
though.
Yeah, well, then you've made a mistake. Um, I personally would kind of put Namala and Yasavage in a bit of a different bucket, and I'd
Yeah,
put them alone. I mean, and then beyond that, I think you have to be ready to, make some sacrifices. Like I think the good thing that the Jays have is they do have this group of youngish position players who are MLB ready. And it was
yeah,
sort of surprising during the offseason that they held on to all these guys. I sort of figured, especially with the bullpen needing an upgrade, that would be a position that they drew from. I actually kind of speculated in the past that Barger was going to be the one who had value to other teams because they saw his tools and that
yeah.
might be a move that would happen. And obviously, it's very good for the team that did not play out like that. But they still have guys like, the Rodens and Wagners and Loperfitos of the world. And I could see them dipping into that. Relvis Martinez, too. I mean, obviously, he's having a brutal season at AAA, but he's a reclamation project that another franchise could be interested in. I could see them drawing on that pool relatively heavily because I think, honestly, my personal opinion is that's a type of player that the league overvalues.
Right.
And I think that the Jays have overvalued that type of player in the past, the player who is ready, but is probably topping out as kind of a platoon part-time sort of player. But the reality about that player is cheap. That player
Yeah.
can go on your MLB roster and they're cheap, and then you hope for the best. And there's a lot of franchises in baseball who like the idea of a cheap MLB player who you can kind of dream on a little bit. And they can help fulfill that dream for, the Pittsburgh Pirates of the world or the Athletics or
It's
whoever.
the Will Robertsons types, the guys who are kind of in the they show some things, but tough to kind of get them time on the MLB roster.
Yeah.
Nick, we really appreciate you taking the time. Really appreciate you coming back on the pod. This was great, really great insight, and always great getting to catch up with you. We keep reading your work, we'll keep listening to everywhere that you're talking, and yeah, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That is Nick Ashbourne, a Blue Jays writer at Sportsnet and the host of the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast and Jays Talk. You can find him on Twitter at Nick Ashbourne. That is going to do it for us here today at the Bird's Eye View podcast. Make sure to hit the subscribing like buttons if you're watching on YouTube. You can find us there at the Bird's Eye View podcast. If you're listening along on the audio provider of your choice, make sure to drop a follow and review. You can follow all of us on Twitter. I am at Worden_Zach. Jori is at Jori Negin-Shecter. And the pod is at BEV_pod. Thank you so much for listening.